Okay. All right, everybody, let's get started. Thank you for coming. I'm Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies, and we're here to celebrate our shared values in the highest standards in the social sciences, and in particular, recognizing the legacies of Warren Miller and Phil Converse, and also appreciating the contributions of Tali Mendelberg, our visitor today. We hold this lecture every year, and it really is one of the highlights for me as director. We honor what these two men have created. They both were intellectual leaders, institution builders, and careful, meticulous scholars. It does not need to be said to many within this room, but it is worth reminding and informing those who may not know that these two men, among all others, are most responsible for creating a space for the study of politics within ISR. They are also noteworthy for, of course, much more. They were two of the so-called Four Horsemen who wrote The American Voter, the foundational book that spawned so much to follow in survey research and the study of political behavior. They carried the water for the development of the American National Election Study, which is still the model for all other national political surveys and is celebrating its 75th year. Warren created the ICPSR and founded our Center for Political Studies. Phil was the director of ISR, and perhaps more fittingly for this lecture, he wrote papers and books that led to multiple new subfields within the study of politics. Both of them together were the very center of Michigan political science for decades, which means that they were at the center of the study of behavioral political science. Their influence was massive, is massive, and there is every indication that people will continue to read their work into the future. We in this building and university, indeed in all the social sciences, in our work, traverse scientific paths that they first set down. I'm proud to have this be the 8th Miller Converse Lecture that I have been able to host as director of CPS. We missed 2 due to COVID, probably my last one. On behalf of all who have benefited from these lectures and will benefit from them in the future, including the faculty and staff of CPS, I express my gratitude to the donors who have made this lecture possible, especially the families of Warren and Phil. I'll now turn it over to Nancy, who will introduce our speaker.
So hello, I'm Nancy Burns. I'm the Warren E. Miller Collegiate Professor of Political Science, and I am really pleased to be able to introduce Tali Mendelberg today. Tali is the John Wirt Garrett Professor of Politics at Princeton. She's the co-director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics and the founder and director of the program on inequality there at Princeton. Her books, The Race Card and The Silent Sex, have both received the Philip E. Converse Award for enduring contributions to the study of public opinion. The Race Card also received the APSA Award for the best book in political science. She is in a really good U of M company with these awards. So I'm just going to list some people who, are in the room, maybe close to the room. Ted Brader, Yana Krupnikov, Don Kinder, Howard Schuman, Nick Valentino, Ishmael White, Chris Miller, Phil Converse, Roy Pierce, Sam Eldersveld, Angus Campbell, Don Stokes, and Warren Miller. Right. So it's a good group. It's a good group. Both of these books set the standards for the field. And just as an example, I'm going to mention the Race Card. So the work in the Race Card has been elaborated and replicated by many, many scholars since the book came out in 2001. Of course, the book's analyses are so sturdy, so careful, so powerful that when scholars started to find something contrary to Tali's results, 10 or so years ago, that was a clear sign to them, not that there was a problem with Tali's work, but that the world had changed. It was that sturdy. Tali's U of M PhD is from 1994. She was one of the earliest Ford Fellowship recipients in the department. And if you're a graduate student or faculty in the department, you've probably seen that super great picture of Tali standing next to Gerald Ford. The department shares that every year with the call for the Ford proposals. It's a spectacular picture. And then finally, on a personal note, I came to Ann Arbor in 1990, and I was hugely fortunate to have an office in an astonishing bay at ISR with Tali and with 3/4 of her dissertation committee, and with a fabulous group of other graduate students. The scholars in that bay especially, and at U of M more generally, gave me maybe my first education on the theoretical and empirical tools of interdisciplinary social science. The tools that are, yeah, well, okay. I think those interdisciplinary tools are one of the hallmarks of a Michigan PhD. Tali and I also taught an undergraduate course together in gender and politics, and I was, kind of crazy lucky in that. The students were crazy lucky in that. Imagine coming to class and discovering that you've got Tali Mendelberg as your GSI. Wow. Okay. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Tali. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy and Ken, for those introductions. And I'm beyond thrilled to be here. It's an incredible honor. I'm back in my alma mater. I still have flashbacks of defending my dissertation prospectus. Too late. But it's truly, truly an honor to be back here and to be delivering this Miller Converse Lecture. When I teach the American Voter, and Christian Fong, who I think is here, there's Christian, once took that class when he was an undergraduate at Princeton. It was a graduate level class, but he took that class. And I teach the American Voter in that class. I do not refer to them as the Four Horsemen. They're the Fab Four, which I think is a better label. But I'm truly honored to be delivering the Miller Converse Lecture. No pressure at all here. So this project is the politics of disaster prevention, and it's joint work with Nick Short and Marty Gillens. And our point of departure is very familiar to all of you in this room. We are all suffering enormous losses from weather disasters, climate disasters, natural and public health disasters of various kinds. There have been over 340 major disasters related to weather and climate in the US in the last several decades. The total cost of these disasters is estimated to be in the trillions of dollars. And these disasters seem to be increasing in frequency. They seem to be increasing in severity, increasing in the fallout, in the damage. And they include a whole variety of different kinds of phenomena, including wildfires, the most recent spate, of course, from LA, floods, storms, hurricanes, pandemics. It's truly starting to feel biblical. So we're all familiar with this. And the real question is, what's the role of government in this situation? Is there anything that governments could possibly do about what are actually natural phenomena? And experts in disaster planning have issued a firm yes. There are certainly things that government could do. And from experts in disaster planning in particular, we know that there's a whole range of preparedness and prevention activities, which I'm going to call, for the rest of this talk, simply prevention. So when I refer to prevention, what I'm referring to is a wide variety of policy instruments that all have the purpose of mitigating the effects of disaster. preparedness. It could be building infrastructure. It could be technology that will help detect tornadoes. It can be earthquake retrofitting. It can be investing in service management, firefighting services. It can include research and development to detect future pandemics. And if you just look at the text of government policy, here's an example to provide states and local governments financial assistance to implement measures that will permanently reduce or eliminate future damages and losses from natural hazards. So that's an example from a Healy and Malhotra article that looked at the actual text of federal funding. How is this different from other kinds of disaster policy? Well, the alternative is what I'm going to broadly call relief-oriented policies. So this is a range of policy instruments that basically are designed to deliver relief after a disaster has occurred. And here's an example: to assist state and local governments in recovering from the devastating effects of disasters by providing assistance for debris removal, for example. We're all familiar with kind of the basic functions of FEMA. FEMA is there with their water and meal kits. They're there with their temporary housing and so on. So that's kind of a classic example of relief policy. And what's interesting is that these prevention policies are a lot more cost effective than relief policies. So a terrific study from Healy and Malhotra put a dollar estimate on this. Every dollar that federal government spends on preparedness reduces $7 in future damage costs in a single election cycle. And then if you add it up longer term, you get $15 in total future damage costs saved. So it's a very efficient kind of approach. It's a really kind of sensible, rational approach to disaster policy. And of course, different scholars have come up with different estimates of exactly what these savings are and exactly how much to invest. But they all agree that preparedness is really kind of the way to go. That is sort of the rational policy. And by contrast, relief spending seems to have no effect on future damage costs. So if your purpose is to kind of save money over long term, you should really be investing in disaster preparedness and not putting all of your money or so much of your money in immediate disaster relief. And the irony is that the US federal government spends a lot more on relief policies than it does on prevention policies. In the median election cycle, according to one estimate, the federal government spends 35 to 2 per capita, and that ratio is highly imbalanced, right? It's a ratio of 35 to 2 is not exactly in line with this idea that prevention spending is the more cost-effective way to go. Or for another example, FEMA's ratio of relief to prevention spending is 2 to 1. So again, it's highly imbalanced in the opposite direction from what kind of experts in in disaster management would recommend. So the question that motivates our study is, why is this? Why does government seem to underinvest in prevention policy when it seems to be the more kind of cost-effective and rational, reasonable policy for government to pursue? And the main explanation that we've come across in the literature is it's about the voters. The voters want relief policy. The voters reward relief delivery. And so incumbents have sort of learned to target their relief support in order to maximize their chances of winning elections, right? Right before the election happens, if there's a big hurricane or a big storm, we've seen this in Florida, we've seen this in New Jersey in 2012. We've got this immediate influx of relief dollars, and it's targeted in a way so as to maximize electoral support for the incumbent. And a number of scholars have argued it's not targeted in a way that's most efficient in terms of need. So it's not going necessarily to the hardest hit or the neediest areas, it's going to areas that are going to maximize electoral support. And in the literature, voters are often thought to not reward prevention policies. Healy and Malhotra in this seminal article summed it up as voters offer scant incentive to presidents to pursue cost-effective preparedness spending, but do encourage them to send in the cavalry after the damage has been done and lives have been lost. And they conclude these inconsistencies distort the incentives of public officials, leading the government to underinvest in disaster preparedness, thereby causing substantial public welfare losses. So the main blame here, the main explanation for why we have this unbalanced policy really lies with voters and their kind of bad decision making here. So if you look further at the literature on this, you'll see a variety of reasons that have been offered for why voters would reward relief policy specifically. And they all kind of tend to revolve around this idea that relief spending seems to ordinary people to be more effective. It seems efficient, it seems transparent, it seems accountable. It seems like the kind of government policy that ordinary people can kind of wrap their minds around. And that consists of things like identifiable recipients. You can see in news coverage, here are some individuals who are getting that FEMA trailer. Here are some individuals who've been helped after they've lost their house. Here are some identifiable people, real people who are actually testifying to or appear to be benefiting from the relief efforts. And so it looks to many ordinary people like there are these immediate results of the policy. They can see, even if it's not directly affecting them personally or it's not around them in actual physical space, they can see it through news coverage. It's tangible, right? Here's a check that's coming. Here's a trailer that's being set up. People's homes are being rebuilt. So it's quite concrete. At least that's the argument. And relatedly, scholars have thought that perhaps this aspect of relief policy is especially appealing to lots of people who tend to distrust government to begin with and are not going to be willing to just sort of take it on faith that elected representatives are doing what they're supposed to do behind the scenes in a way that's invisible, right? How do you know if a disaster has been prevented? You don't see the disaster. By definition, it's not visible, it's not tangible, it's not concrete. You can't point to any individuals who are benefiting from the absence of a disaster. So the idea is there are these kind of ordinary heuristics that feed people into supporting that particular relief policy. And in addition, there's been a number of rational choice models or decision theoretic models that have kind of reinforced this idea, right? That relief perhaps is just more easily attributed to concrete government action. You can point to things that the incumbent president or the incumbent party are doing. And likewise, there's been a number of reasons offered in the literature for why voters would not support prevention. And they often revolve around this idea that people are using misleading, biased heuristics, cognitive shortcuts. They're trying their best, but information is inherently limited and there's only so much that you can draw inferences from what's available. And moreover, people are just busy and they have these kind of shortcuts that they rely on in order to make sense of the political world and perhaps even their own lives. So I've listed here some of the many heuristics that people in the literature have pointed to. There are things like temporal myopia. There's something called present bias that economists have studied and have documented. People just seem to naturally discount the future. The further the future is, the more it gets discounted. They're very focused on the here and the now. They don't like to think ahead. It's difficult to project ahead, and it's just much cognitively easier to think about what you're going to do right now, what your benefits are going to be right now, and what's going to happen in the immediate future, rather than some distant future down the road. And relatedly, people may not be very effective at learning from the experiences of disaster, whether it's the own personal experiences or experiences that they're exposed to through news media or social media, through vicarious channels. But basically the idea is, again, people are myopic. They're not uptaking, they're not updating very effectively or in a very systematic way. And so a number of studies have now documented that despite personal exposure to natural disasters, extreme weather, extreme temperatures or floods or fires, whatever it is, despite being personally exposed to it, or even despite their subjective perceptions of the likelihood of being exposed to it, that doesn't seem to correlate very strongly with their opinion about disaster policy or their support for specific policies that are designed to prevent and prepare for disaster. And so generally, people seem to not really take these future threats seriously, even after they're encountering personally or vicariously these extreme experiences. And so it's kind of a lost opportunity for people to step up and kind of do the right thing or adjust their attitudes. And relatedly, people seem to underestimate the effectiveness of prevention. So they overestimate the cost of prevention. And Talbot Andrews, who I gather was just here recently, has documented what they call cost conflation. So there seems to be a heuristic where people assume that if the damage of the disaster is high, the cost of preventing it is also high, and they don't want to pay that very high cost. So regardless of which of these biases you think are the right ones, you might think some of these aren't very persuasive or probably don't explain a lot of what's going on. But the literature seems to be kind of focused on, yes, there's any number of these misleading heuristics, and combined, they tend to lead people to not support prevention very strongly. Well, we argue that despite all of these studies, the evidence is not conclusive. And so direct evidence that prevention spending does not actually garner support for incumbents, support for candidates, is actually quite scarce. And when we really honed in on all of these studies and really combed through the literature in a close way, we concluded that the only study that actually tested for the effects of prevention policy on electoral support is this Healy and Malhotra study, which is a fantastic study, but they did not measure individual preferences or behavior at all. It's all at the aggregate level. So they've got this longitudinal data set that goes over the course of several decades, where they show that incumbent increases in relief spending is highly correlated with support for the incumbent in terms of marginal vote, and yet prevention spending is uncorrelated. So we think that's very important evidence, but ultimately it's very hard to draw conclusions about whether the public supports prevention policies if you don't directly measure people's attitudes, opinions, and beliefs about prevention. And we agree with the literature that there's very good evidence that incumbent spending on relief does garner electoral rewards, but we don't agree with this literature that we can draw any real conclusions about prevention support. And we think that there are some reasons to think that people might favor prevention in some meaningful way. So first of all, just because there are these cognitive biases that push people towards relief doesn't necessarily mean that those biases will always apply and always override everything else. And actually, my colleague Marcus Pryor has shown in recent work that myopia is actually worse for past events than it is for future, right? So people are actually worse when it comes to looking at the past than when it comes to thinking about what's coming ahead in the future. So this time horizon business, where people are supposedly just focused on the here and now, actually doesn't seem to bear out consistently. We also know that a variety of biases can be overridden by countervailing heuristics or by other values or by other beliefs, by other concerns. So just because there are these biases doesn't necessarily mean that they're the ones who are overriding everything else. And in addition, there's this very interesting study, formal model by Ashworth et al. That predicts that rational voters would in fact hold incumbents accountable for a lack of prevention and not just for relief spending. We also found that there's a couple of studies that have actually tested prevention and relief opinion, one against the other, and actually show results that we think are consistent with a pro-prevention public opinion. So Bechtel and Menino are an example of this, and they report 60% of their sample supporting spending between $2 and $14 million on a dam to avoid $20 million in future flood damages. And yet the paper concludes, we think, contrary to its own finding, that people resist prevention policies. We also found an interesting study by Anderson et al., where they gave people, respondents, the amount of money that their state spent for preparedness and the amount of money their state spent on relief. And they also gave people the national average of this spending amount. And they asked people if they want to spend more or less on preparedness and if they want to spend more or less on relief policies. And in a sample of MTurk respondents, they found that respondents wanted more of both. They wanted prevention and they wanted relief. So we think that there's actually reason to suspect that this really strong conclusion about how people are just not going to support preparedness and prevention is probably not right. But we needed more data, right? So this MTurk finding is intriguing, but we want a better national sample, nationally representative, and we think that we need more targeted and more precise measures of prevention and relief opinion and support. So that's what we did in our study. We designed a couple of surveys that intended to do just that. So the features that I'm going to tell you about for our survey are, first of all, we're going to compare preferences on disaster spending to preferences regarding spending on other popular areas like healthcare, highways, and bridges. We're going to compare support for increased spending on disaster prevention against the same exact thing, but for disaster relief. So we're going to do that head-to-head test. And we're going to build in some trade-offs. So it's not so easy to say, yes, I want more spending on everything. We're going to warn people that this might require an increase in taxes. And we're going to then force them to choose between prevention and relief. So they can't have more of both. They have to choose between the two of them. We're also going to go through a bunch of tests and measures to see if these preferences are real in some ways, right? So are they going to be consistent across different wordings? Are they going to be consistent across different formats? What if we try to push people and we give them reasons for the other side? Will we see stable preferences? And also, what if we give people an opportunity to talk in their own terms before we introduce these ideas about prevention and relief? So unprompted mentions of these concepts. And finally, we're going to evaluate people's support for an incumbent candidate who has spent or has not spent on relief and on prevention. So throughout, what we're going to be doing is doing this kind of head-to-head comparison, prevention versus relief in all ways. So we have a sample of almost 3,000 individuals. We did this twice. We did this in 2021, and we did it again 2 years later in 2023. It's a national non-probability sample. We use standard quotas and standard weights, and we pre-registered our predictions. So I'm going to cut to the chase here. This is the bottom line. Here's what we find. We find that support for prevention spending is at least as high as support for popular spending categories. We find that support for prevention spending is the same or higher as support for relief spending. In forced choice, prevention wins out over relief. And even groups that we thought would be very skeptical, Trump supporters, people who distrust government and so on, exhibit majority support for prevention. Even after we give them reasons why relief should be preferred, they still are more likely to support prevention. And before we introduce any of these concepts, when we give people an open-ended chance to just talk in their own terms about what comes to mind when they think about disasters, we find that people are at least as likely to mention preparedness and prevention concepts as they are to mention relief concepts. And these open-ended mentions correlate with later closed-ended choices, suggesting that all of this is a meaningful attitude. And at the end, I'm going to show you some brief results where we try to validate that what people are saying in surveys has something to do with what they actually do when it comes time to vote. So I'll show you some suggestive results from ballot measures that target preparedness and prevention. So here's the first finding. So we asked people earlier in the survey to indicate whether you would like to see more or less government spending in each area, and reminding them more spending might require a tax increase to pay for it. And what you can see here is that spending on natural and public health disasters is pretty similar to spending on highways and bridges and spending on health. These are the two categories we picked a priori as being probably very popular. And you can see, yes, they are quite popular. People want somewhat more spending on health, highways and bridges, and natural and public health disasters. More relevant, their support for spending on disaster prevention is quite similar to their support for spending on natural and public health disasters, which again, as I said, is similar to support for spending on these popular categories. So people seem to want somewhat more spending on disaster prevention and natural and public health disasters, as well as these popular spending categories. And by contrast, disaster relief spending is somewhat less supported, right? So if anything, it looks like people want more spending on prevention a little bit more than they want more spending on disaster relief. So then we forced a trade-off, right? Because it's easy to say, sure, let's just spend more. Yeah, maybe there'll be a tax increase, maybe not. But yes, I just want more government to do more things. So we forced a choice, and we said some people want the government to prioritize disaster relief over prevention, and other people want to prioritize disaster prevention over relief, counterbalanced, randomized order. Which option do you prefer for natural and public health disasters? And you can see that a large majority want to spend ahead to prevent future natural and public health disasters. Only 20% chose spend later to respond after natural and public health disasters occur. A few people had other ideas. So then we wanted to see, well, how wide is this support? And we found that it's pretty darn wide. So people who voted for Trump or said that they voted for Trump, people who identify as Republicans, people who have low trust in government, people who don't see a need for experts in society. It doesn't really matter which subgroup we pick. We find pretty strong support for prevention spending, at least as much as spending on relief. And again, our trade-off question in red, prioritize prevention over relief, seems to cross that 0.50 threshold pretty consistently. So it looks like support is pretty wide. All right, so then we offered people a bunch of reasons for why they would support relief spending and reasons for why they would support prevention spending. And we gave each the two sets. So everybody got the pro-prevention reasons and the pro-relief reasons. And we generated these reasons. We generated them from a reading of the literature. We generated them from news reports and from open-ended responses in surveys. So here's all the reasons that we gave people, and now I'm pooling across order. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our order experiment in a second, but now pooling across the order in which they got these relief and prevention reasons, one thing that jumps out is that most of the reasons that we offered for prevention are higher rated than most of the reasons we offered for relief. So these pro-prevention reasons hover around a good reason. Most people rated them a good reason for prevention. And most people rated the relief reasons as only a little bit higher than a fair reason. So overall, these reasons that we came up with for prevention seem to be more favored than the reasons we came up for to prioritize relief. On average, the prevention reasons are 17 percentage points more popular than the relief reasons. And in addition, the highest rated reason, which is that disasters cause enormous personal losses and suffering. And that's why we would want to support more spending on prevention, and that's why we would want to support more spending on relief. That reason is rated as higher as a reason to support prevention than it is as a reason to support relief. And the second highest reason, which is effectiveness, that spending is going to be more effective if it's for prevention, or it's going to be more effective if it's for relief, again, is quite popular for both prevention and relief. So it doesn't look like there's any reason that's kind of off the charts more popular as a reason for relief. It looks like people are kind of buying into this idea of prevention, and they're using this rationale of disasters are just very costly. They're just really bad negative events. And that an ounce of prevention saves a pound in cure. So this idea of effectiveness seems to be quite powerful as reasons to support prevention, as well as reasons to prioritize relief. One other thing that I want you to notice is, here's this one: relief spending is transparent, whereas prevention is not. That's one of the key kind of factors in the literature that finds support for relief spending and not for prevention spending. But we're finding that it's not a dominant reason to support relief. People like it pretty well, but it's not kind of a thing that really jumps out here in the data. So then we use the fact that we randomized the order of whether people got pro-prevention spending or pro-relief spending first to look at stability. So for the pro-prevention first group, they were shown the reasons to prioritize prevention over relief. They evaluated each of these reasons. And then after that set, we asked them, when you think about the most persuasive reasons, do you agree or disagree with prioritizing disaster prevention over disaster relief? And then we showed them all these reasons for relief. We asked them to evaluate the reasons and then asked them again to agree or disagree with prioritizing relief over prevention, right? So that was the pro-prevention first group. And then the pro-relief first group got everything but in reverse order, right? So they got the reasons for relief, then the reasons for prevention. And what you can see here is when they got just reasons for one side, so just reasons for prevention or just reasons for relief, the support for prioritizing prevention over relief is higher than the support for prioritizing relief over prevention, right? So prevention priority wins out over relief priority. And then when they get both reasons, we still see the same pattern. People still seem to prefer prevention over relief, even after they heard the arguments from both sides. Now, looking at the same data, but just now more directly testing for which attitudes are less stable, what we find is subtracting support after both sides from support after one side, that the difference in people's support for policies between just getting one side and getting two sides is about equal for prevention and for relief, which tells us that these attitudes are about equally susceptible or unsusceptible to change from the reasons, right? If you give people reasons for both sides, they should be changing their minds at some point, at some level, and they do, but to a moderate extent. They change only by about 6 to 8 percentage points, and they do so about equally regarding prevention and relief. So it doesn't look like a preference for prevention is any less stable or any more susceptible to change from exposure to reasons than a preference for relief. Okay, then we're going to look at support for a candidate for governor of your state who either did or did not increase spending on relief or on prevention. And again, we reinforce this idea that they increase taxes and they cut other programs to pay for it. So again, we're really trying hard here to get at meaningful opinions. So it's not just people saying, sure, all of this sounds good. I want all of this. We want to emphasize that there's going to be some trade-offs and it's not such an easy decision to make. And what you can see here very clearly is that the electoral benefit from increasing spending on prevention, which is here in blue, is much larger than the electoral benefit to an incumbent from increased spending on relief. It's 3 times as big. All right, so before all of this, we asked people open-endedly, what thoughts come to mind when you think about spending on natural and public health disasters? And the kinds of responses are, for example, it's a necessary expense that the government needs to prioritize and spend to avoid disasters of all kinds. It is not only paying for cleanup after the event. In other words, it's not just about relief. The majority of the money should be spent on prevention. We had not introduced any of these concepts at this point. So these are spontaneous mentions that people are offering in their own words. We did not tell them about relief. We did not tell them about prevention. We just asked thoughts about natural and public health disasters. And so we coded these mentions in a variety of ways. Lots of nitty-gritty that I could go into, but the bottom line is we did human coding and we also did machine learning. For each concept, we had human coders code 20% of the sample for the mention of relief and the mention of prevention, and whether it was supported or not, whether the respondent supported relief or supported prevention. We also coded for some respondents the number of thoughts related to each of these concepts. Here's our definition of prevention. It's spending ahead of a disaster to reduce the risk that a disaster will occur or to minimize its effects. This includes preparedness, it includes climate mitigation, it includes vaccines, it includes a variety of natural and public health measures. And we define for our coders what relief is, which is spending after a disaster is underway to help with the recovery from that disaster. We included money, we included in-kind, we included things like food and shelter, references to FEMA, for example, count as relief. So we actually tried to code things in a way that gave the benefit of the doubt to relief. If there was a doubt, we put it on the relief side of the ledger. We also conducted, we used a training set and a test set on the remaining 80% of the data, and we developed a lexicon, which we then refined. And again, these are familiar to you at this point. Prevention includes any mentions of preparation, prevention, planning, ready, future, ahead, before, in advance, faster, quicker, improve, shot, vaccine, climate change, global warming. And relief includes things like relieving, repairing, restore, rebuild, assist, support, respond or responses, aid, help, need, food, shelter, FEMA, and Red Cross. We validated this lexicon. We got pretty good validation statistics, and here are the results. So the mentions, as you can see, are pretty similar. The frequency of relief mentions are pretty similar to the frequency of prevention mentions, and support also is similar. So when people mention relief, how likely are they to be mentioning it in a supportive way? When people mention prevention, are they mentioning it in a supportive way? And you can see that it's pretty similar. Relief and prevention are pretty similar on support and on frequency of mentions. And if we count the number of thoughts in the human coding, we again get a similar number, about 2.5 per respondent for relief, about 2.4 per respondent for prevention. And it's not the case that people who mention one will always mention the other. So in about half the sample, they mention one but not the other. So these seem to be somewhat distinct. And these open-ended mentions in turn predict the later closed-ended responses that people gave to our questions about their preferences. And the effect is about 3 times bigger from prevention mentions than from relief mentions, right? So if you compare the numbers here in column 1, this is predicting mentions of relief on support for relief compared to predicting support for relief from relief mentions and predicting support for prevention from prevention mentions. And the prevention effect is much bigger than the relief effect here. And then when we do the forced trade-off, again, we see that prevention mentions over here are much more predictive than relief mentions. So if we're looking for different ways to assess the strength of these preferences, it looks like prevention preferences are as real as relief preferences, if not more so. All right, so you are probably thinking by this point, okay, fine, but the study was done in 2021 in the height of COVID. Maybe this is a very specific finding that's limited by a very particular time. Maybe it's really kind of mostly a COVID effect. People are sitting in their homes and going, gee, I wish somebody had done something about this pandemic. Why are we all stuck at home and everything is closed and nothing is working and we're all under mortal threat? Somebody should have done something about this. And in fact, we did ask a question in our study about COVID, and we do see a majority of the people responding accordingly. So the best that we can do is as follows. First of all, we can replicate after COVID salience is a little bit lower, which we did in 2023. Oh, excuse me. First of all, we can look at our open-ended responses and see whether people are mentioning natural disasters or mentioning public health disasters. If it's really about COVID, they should be talking a lot more about public health disasters and not so much about natural disasters. And yet we find that the frequency is similar. So it's not the case that people are just saying, oh yeah, this is about public health. They're also talking a lot about natural disasters. Okay, then we searched major surveys and polls that were fielded before COVID, so in the decade or so before COVID, and we found two surveys that had relevant questions. One showed 70% who said disaster preparedness was a very important national priority, and the other found 73% who said an important priority is preparing the public for public health problems or injuries resulting from natural disasters. So that's suggestive evidence. We also found two academic studies conducted before COVID that are in line with our findings. I already mentioned that Bechtel and Menino study about the dam. People are willing to spend between $2 and $14 million to prevent $20 million in future costs by building a dam. I mentioned the Anderson et al. Study as well. That was done right before COVID. So now I get to our own study in 2023, and our thinking is 2023, COVID is still salient, but not as salient. So we should see a dramatic change from 2021 to 2023 if what happened is our original survey was simply catching people at a particularly pro-prevention time. So what we find is that support for disaster spending, first of all, is only a little bit lower in 23 than it was in 21. And that pattern holds for all spending types. And prevention still has more support than relief spending. We also, in this 2023 study, randomized whether we asked about natural disasters or public health disasters. And what we find is that support for prevention is a little bit higher for health than for natural disasters, but it's a pretty small effect. So we're not seeing anything dramatically different when we're asking about natural versus public health disasters. All right, finally, again, you might be wondering, as we did, what does all of this survey stuff have to do with people's actual real-world behavior? Are people actually voting for prevention when they're given the chance to do so? So what we did is we searched a database that contains pretty much all state ballot measures. At least it's as comprehensive a data set as we know of state ballot measures. And we identified 12 measures since 1990 that we thought are pretty good, clean measures of preparedness or prevention. And what we found was that these had a 75% passage rate, which is a lot higher than the 46% passage rate for these ballot measures overall. So it's not a smoking gun piece of evidence, but we find it helpful in suggesting that people do seem to put these preferences into action when they're given the chance to do that. When they're allowed to vote on it, they seem to like it much better than they do the average ballot measure. In addition, we found one ballot measure that had included a pre-election poll assessing public support or opposition to the exact measure. And that was for Prop 1E in California in 2006. And in the pre-election poll, 60% indicated that they supported the proposition, which is pretty close to the actual passage margin of 64%. So we think that what people are saying about this stuff in surveys seems to track somewhat well with what they're actually doing when they're given a chance to actually act on this stuff. So to summarize, what we found is that support for prevention is comparable to support for categories that are quite popular. Bridges, highways, health. People seem to be relating to this disaster stuff as they do to other kind of public goods, right? They want roads, they want bridges, they want health being provided. They see a role for government. Your average American wants government to do something about these problems. And we were surprised to find initially that support for prevention is actually higher than support for relief. And when we really force people to trade off to choose one or the other, we find that they lean pretty strongly towards prevention. And even groups that are skeptical of government seem to prefer prevention over relief. Even after we give people a bunch of reasons, all the reasons we could think of to support the other side, they still prefer prevention. And the electoral benefits to candidates seem to be much more powerful for prevention spending than for relief spending. And people, when we haven't introduced these concepts, seem to come up with these concepts on their own spontaneously. Of course, the big threat here is that maybe this is all some kind of recent development. We can't definitively rule that out, but we do find some evidence from before 2019 in line with these findings. And the real world ballot propositions seem to reinforce that. So we find support for prevention is not the problem, is not a voter problem. It's, if anything, a problem in other parts of the political system because public opinion on prevention seems to be meaningful. People seem to want this kind of policy. So we think that the low spending that Healy and Malhotra observed and other scholars have documented is not rooted in public demand for relief over prevention. And we think scholars should be thinking about institutions and communication processes between public officials or candidates and their publics. There's some evidence emerging that public officials are misperceiving their constituents. They think that voters will not reward prevention. There's a couple of cool studies that have done some field experiments where they inform officials about the true support among their constituencies, and they observe responses in line with officials updating their beliefs about what their constituencies want. We think that institution scholars should be studying questions like what are officials actually communicating to the public and to their constituencies about what they're doing about prevention. What does the media do? Is the media providing the public with information about what candidates have done, what incumbents have done to prevent and prepare for disaster? And perhaps there's bureaucratic failure to study, and perhaps the real problem here is not with demand or even what elected officials are doing, but rather with the actual nuts and bolts of how policy gets generated. Perhaps it's really about bureaucratic failure more than anything else. But all of these really point us away from kind of the conventional wisdom in the literature, which says that voters are just looking at relief spending. They just want to see those relief checks. They just want to see FEMA trailers. They just want to see meals and bottled water distributed or paper towels distributed. We don't think that's really the main explanation. We think that there's much more public support than commonly believed. So that's it. Thank you very much.
All right, question.
I'll come around with the microphone if you don't mind raising your hands. Saw the front row first.
I wanted to ask you, as you can see, I am in favor of prevention, but prevention is a standard expense that occurs ahead of time, while relief is a conditional expense that, you know, it may take 20 years or it may never happen. So there is a probability assessment that should enter in this calculation. Have you included it?
Yeah, so we did not directly measure this. We didn't directly ask people for their opinions, conditional on different time horizons. My colleague Marcus Pryor has done a lot of much more precise work on that time mechanism. And his overall conclusion is that that's not the source of the problem. Certainly it explains part of it, but that it's not the case that people are just not preferring and not rewarding prevention spending because they're not interested in waiting 20 years to see the result of it, at least at the mass level among ordinary people. And then there are a couple of recent studies that have looked at officials' decision-making about this, elected officials, local officials' decision-making. And it doesn't look like they're reluctant to spend on preparedness and prevention because they're worried they won't be rewarded long-term. That doesn't seem to
no,
be...
no, no. What I'm saying is my calculation, whether I'm going to pay ahead of time or to pay maybe in 10 years or in 20 years may be different.
Yes, that's right.
So therefore, my answer about whether I prefer prevention or relief is conditional on this probability of how likely is it to have a flood.
Yes, so you would think that that would be a powerful predictor, but in fact, it turns out not to be a very powerful predictor. So people's subjective perception of risk doesn't predict their support for prevention policy very powerfully. The things that seem to predict that much more powerfully are symbolic attitudes, sociotropic attitudes. So things like, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Do you generally favor government spending to address social problems or not? And let's see if I can find this here. I was talking to Nick Valentino last night, and he was asking me some questions, so I put in these slides. And then I realized I have to do this because I cannot come back to Michigan and not talk about racial resentment. So here's the result for predicting support for disaster spending we did lots of models. Here's just one, here's an example of one model. So we did measure, have you been exposed to serious illnesses from COVID yourself or loved ones? Have you been exposed to a natural disaster, you or your loved ones? Have you been exposed to both of them, both COVID and natural disasters? There is some effect. So about a 3 to a 5 percentage point effect on spending more on disasters. So there is something from that. But racial resentment has a much bigger effect. So if you think that African Americans should work harder, if you think that Irish, Italians, Jews, and other immigrants work their way up and African Americans should do the same without special favors, if you hold on to those kinds of sentiments, that is a much bigger predictor of whether you want more government spending or not on disasters, as well as many other areas, many other solutions. So it seems like it's really more these sociotropic or symbolic attitudes that predict where people fall on this issue. It's not so much a kind of risk assessment of how am I going to be affected, when am I going to be affected, what's the damage going to be to me, have my loved ones suffered. It's not so much about that. It's not personal experience or even risk attitudes related to it that seem to predict it.
Of course. Thank you.
So this is prevention. This is just control spending.
That's right. So this is just do you want to spend more or less on natural and public health disasters? But we find a very similar finding when we look at prevention spending and when we look at relief spending. So it doesn't matter what aspect of disaster spending we're looking at, we're finding very similar patterns, very similar effects.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask a question about the potential mechanism that could be kind of driving the divergence. So you mentioned a couple of potential institutional ones, and I wanted to basically run one by you and see if you thought it could be happening, which is that it may simply be harder to pass prevention legislation than relief, because if I'm the senator from Michigan and I try to pass relief prevention for Michigan, then the senator from North Carolina is going to say, wait, why not my state? Whereas for relief, you don't really have to law rule write that. Like, you're only passing relief for something that already happened. Do you think that might be driving maybe the divergence between why we see so much more relief than prevention spending?
That's a very good question, and I really don't know the answer to that. I don't study legislative policy making, so I don't know if that's a plausible explanation or not. It does seem like prevention policy is underserved, underprovided at various levels of government. It's not just legislators, and it's not just the federal government. It seems to be a problem that's kind of endemic to government. So I suspect that's not the only explanation, if it is part of the explanation. What I'd really love is for my institution's colleagues to get into this question and start looking at how does prevention policy get enacted and implemented, and when is that spending on prevention, when does that go up? Who makes it go up, and why?
Thank you.
I think I saw Professor Kinder first.
I have first a confession and then a question. The confession goes back to Nancy's introduction, where she said that Professor Mendelberg's first book, The Race Card, won every award there is. The Race Card book grew out of a dissertation that I supervised. And when Tali proposed this, I said she absolutely should not do it. But she disagreed and proceeded, and the book won all the awards. Okay, that's the confession. The question is, when you started out listing and specifying all these alternative heuristics on one side or the other, it reminded me of a point that Jan Elster made years ago in his little great book, I think, Nuts and Bolts for the Social Sciences, which is that social scientists are very good at being able to develop and specify mechanisms, but not so good at specifying when they're turned on, when heuristics become relevant and when they don't. And so this question goes to your explanation for, suppose you're right here in demonstrating that there's lots of public support for prevention, maybe more even than support for relief. So do you have a story about which mechanisms are being turned on that can account for this? And if so, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I don't have a story for why average level of support is high for prevention. I can surmise it looks like the kind of support we see for building highways and bridges, just in terms of the level. The level is similar. And when we delve into the predictors, sort of which individuals are especially supportive and which relatively less supportive, everyone's kind of more than 50% supportive, but what are the predictors, individual level factors that seem to really increase support? It looks like it's these ideas about hard work and desert and certain identity groups that tend to deserve and more or less government assistance. So it's things like racial resentment. It's also what we call racial unsympathy. So this is kind of the relative effect here, conditional on controls for demographics, party ID, and things like this. Racial resentment is a predictor, and so is lack of sympathy for African Americans. So it seems like the kinds of factors that lead people to support other kinds of strong government intervention, other public goods, spending on health and highways and bridges, spending on, kind of investing in people, those mechanisms seem to account for this as well.
So preparation is like social security.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So I'm wondering if the results might be driven, at least a little bit, by certain subsets of the population, maybe those who live along the coast and are particularly concerned about rising seawater, and therefore they're very much higher in support for prevention, and that drives the overall aggregate results a little bit. And you could say the same thing about a few other parts of the country.
Yeah. Yeah. So we started this project and we had the same kind of intuition, right? We thought along the lines of the literature, people aren't really going to support this prevention stuff, and we will be able to identify certain groups that do, certain pockets. We thought maybe personal exposure would have something to do with it. When we looked at the data, it just doesn't conform to that, right? So these exposure measures are kind of the best we can do in our survey, but you don't have to take our word for it. There have been other similar studies that found, for example, being exposed to extreme temperatures does shift people's opinions about things like climate change or policy to address climate change. The change is very temporary. It evaporates. People don't seem to learn in any kind of long-term way. It doesn't matter if you measure it as objective, actual exposure, if you measure it as subjective risk perception, if you measure it as the likelihood that I'll be affected in the future. So other studies that have looked at this consistently find that this personal exposure hypothesis, it just doesn't predict opinion very well. There doesn't seem to be a strong, consistent, and long-term impact of where you live, how hazardous it is. It just doesn't seem to matter as much as these general social attitudes and political attitudes, which I was somewhat surprised about when I started this. I really thought, oh, surely there'll be some of this, but it's consistent with kind of our general knowledge about where people come up with their opinions about what government should do.
Raises a question for future research, perhaps, about why people who are in areas where they ought to be disproportionately supportive of prevention aren't any more supportive than everybody else.
Yeah.
I think, Maggie, you were next.
So I just had a follow-up question about the racial resentment question. So in each of these, you were talking about racial resentment. It was correlated with people's support for more spending. Does racial resentment also predict the prioritization of prevention over relief?
It doesn't predict it very strongly. It predicts support for more spending on prevention. It predicts support for more spending on relief about the same amount. So it's not a big predictor. It does some work, but yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, but it's not making some people say more impatient versus others, or sort of in terms of so why it is that some people would choose to support relief if that was, but it doesn't explain the difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
So maybe I'm a little reluctant to let the voters off the hook this quickly after taking your class. I think if you ask like this question to like Vulcans or to Skynet or some sort of super rational, emotionless entity, they would all say like, yeah, oh, obviously you should prioritize prevention over relief. But humans don't always make decisions that way. Sometimes they get hot, right? And they make when they go to vote, I think maybe they're often making decisions angry or enthusiastic or afraid or something like that. And it seems like the survey instruments are very clinical and kind of encouraging us to think in that more Vulcan-like rational way. Do you think that if you heated people up, you would get the same sort of prioritization?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, a priori, I would expect that people might get emotional in either direction, right? So you've got the immediate salience of a disaster that just hit, and it's sort of all hands on deck, save those lives immediately right now at any cost. I can imagine that sort of mechanism. I can also, that being translated into, we never should go through this again, right? I can imagine emotional intensity wrapped up and triggered by that thought. And in our survey, we asked people about COVID, and there's a strong majority support for this idea that government should have prevented this. Government should have spent to prevent this from happening. And again, it's pretty widespread. It doesn't really matter which subgroup we look at, that was the majority sentiment. So I can imagine it going in both or either direction. I wouldn't expect emotion to necessarily point people in one policy direction or another. What I will add another thing, which is totally speculative, which is, again, this is an explanation that is beyond my area of expertise and beyond any data that I have or that I've looked at. But my intuition is, as we know, in a lot of policymaking situations, it's not your average voter that gets a say. Policy doesn't necessarily reflect the preferences of the median voter. It's more intense groups, it's more organized groups, it's the groups that are able to coordinate and to show up and to put money behind their preferences. And it's that organization of interest that seems to influence policy much more than what your median constituent wants. And I would love to see explanations that look at that mechanism specifically. And it may be that there are some organized policy groups that benefit from relief but don't benefit from preparedness, that have a greater say. So I would love to hear more from my institutional colleagues about these kinds of mechanisms.
I was just curious if you could tell us a bit more about the details of the disaster exposure measure.
Of the disaster
The
exposure
disaster
measure?
exposure measure.
Yeah, so these are questions that we ask people whether they themselves or their friends or relatives have experienced severe illness from COVID or the fallout from natural disaster. And then we coded the COVID exposure measure and all the other measures on the 0 to 1 scale. And we included them in models, both one at a time and as experiencing both.
This is great, Tali. I had to step out for a second, so you may have already spoken to this, but I was drawn to the fact that you apparently get no effects for party in this table you're showing here on screen. And I'm wondering if you were surprised by that, and if, I guess another version of this question is also that if voters are so uniform in their concern about prevention, then why don't they always vote that way? I mean, and the example that comes to mind, I think it's a version of the same question, but you'll tell me if it's not, is the in the midst of the pandemic in 2020, the candidates in the two major parties had arguably different postures on preventative measures with respect to the pandemic.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the party ID null effect here is because there are these intervening variables that we've included as predictors or picking up the effect of party ID. When we omit a lot of these intervening variables, we do see actually a big effect of party ID. So party does matter in that sense. It's just that it works through racial resentment or through opinions about the size of government. It works through opinions about trustworthiness of experts and the media and so on. So that's that one. It's actually a very powerful predictor if you just look at it on its own. Why don't people always support prevention? Real politics, real life is complicated. And of course, when party leaders line up on alternate sides of an issue, then we know what happens. Partisan polarization follows as a result of it. I will say that Donald Trump actually deserves a great deal of credit. His administration deserves a great deal of credit in helping to develop the COVID vaccine. Operation Warp Speed is an incredible example of government effectiveness to try to prevent COVID infections. But unfortunately, he didn't run on that, and the party hasn't run on that. So I think what we're seeing is when public officials and candidates take very visible positions on some specific issue, it's very hard to combat that. And in general, people are not always going to be voting their preferences on any given issue, right? The vote decision is very complex, lots of different considerations that go into it. And even in the data that we looked at, those propositions that we identified that are prevention and preparedness oriented, they don't have a 100% passage rate. In fact, I think we have 3 of them in California, and only 1 out of those 3 passed in California. You can speculate about what's happening in California. These are, sort of odd processes, very complicated. But I don't think we should set that as the standard. We shouldn't expect 100%, right?
Did I see your hand up?
So I want to go back to this and the prior question about the racial resentment effect and why you didn't get a difference between prevention and relief. And I think I asked you this question last night when we were walking back to where you're staying. So you really think that this racial resentment effect is just a sort of, folks like that don't support public goods provision, or is it possible that they don't support relief or prevention because the beneficiaries of both are the same and they're not them? They're people who don't deserve to be protected in advance or to get saved if they happen to disaster happens to befall them.
Yeah, so let me see if I can go back to the reasons. One of the reasons we offered people was about the benefits going primarily to immigrants or minorities. So this one here, a lot of the benefit will go to immigrants and minorities. And we had the same over here. A lot of the money will go to immigrants and minorities. So we did it for prevention, as a prevention reason and as a relief reason. And you can see that it's one of the less popular ones. And when we look at it by level of racial resentment, it's the highly resentful respondents who really hate that reason. The low resentment respondents don't necessarily love it, but it's the high resentment people who really hate it. Now, what exactly is the inference from that for support for prevention spending? It's not entirely clear. I mean, if we can move people so radically with that, I'm not sure that they're walking around with that image already in their heads. In fact, maybe it means they're not. So I'm not sure exactly what inference I would draw from that. What I take away from all of this is that a lot of people, including even people who are high on racial resentment, do want prevention policy. So they're not walking around going, I'm going to punish any incumbent who does this kind of stuff because I think they're just wasting money on undeserving people of the wrong outgroup. They don't seem to be thinking of it that way. We can get them to think that way, but they don't seem to be walking around thinking that way.
I have a question for you, Tali. It's a very interesting data collection and analysis, and obviously it opens up a program of future research. And speaking as an alumnus, expecting that you have access to unlimited resources.
I'll be sure to tell my dean that.
All right. I'm wondering about the prospects for future data collection in the following sense. A comparison between a national data collection and a collection in North Carolina and a collection in California, organized, as you would think best, around the possibility that action would be taken to reduce or eliminate the role of FEMA as a national activity, and what the prospects for data collection with these measures might be, distinguishing between national level attitudes and localized attitudes where there have been recent natural disasters, and assessments of what the appropriate role for the federal government is as opposed to state level government.
Yeah. Well, so I suspect that what's happening now in the White House is going to encounter a massive wall of unhappy voters at some point down the line. People want government to solve the problems that they think are to be solved. They want highways and bridges. They want these services that go to benefit the public. And I think disaster spending is one of those things. So I don't think the current administration is either thinking about or fully realizing what the damage is going to be. I'm surprised the Republican Party as a whole is not doing more to prevent this policy from, from being implemented. Maybe they are. My colleague Francis Lee thinks that there's a lot happening behind closed doors that is not being put out for public consumption, that there's a lot of private negotiation. We're already seeing some members of Congress, lobbying and making sure that their local public university is not being cut and their local, National Weather Service office is not being cut, and their, things in their district are protected, things in their state are protected. How successful they're going to be, I don't know. But from this kind of data, I think the idea that the American public, that the median voter wants a radical downsizing of the federal government, I think it's just not right. It's not correct.
Okay, I'm going to take the prerogative of the last question. I think of a local issue that gives me some insight into the why government doesn't spend. And I think about, for example, power outages and the local utility. It's a public finance explanation, which is that the cost of fully preventing power outages is so enormous. Like, people inside the government actually know that it's so vast. It would require putting all the wires underground, require cutting enormous amounts of trees. I mean, they're doing things at the margin. They're doing things very visibly now in the neighborhoods. The utility is getting out and cutting trees on the streets, not in people's backyards, because the streets are very visible, like they're in a political fight at the state level. They're doing symbolic things to show that they're preventing, and the government can do that because it's cheap. But actual, real, cross-the-board disaster prevention is extraordinarily expensive, and I think you undersell how expensive it is in this thing, whereas actually relief from the point of view of a public finance person is actually much less expensive. It's the public opinion part of it that's hard. If the government had been able to prevent it, if the utility company had been able to prevent it, they take the heat. I think you're undersell. I think the prevention of disasters at a aggregate level is actually an enormously expensive proposition. And I wonder if government officials are saying this would break the bank, cause taxes to be so high, et cetera.
Yeah, so I'm not positioned to be able to give updated estimates about all of the different prevention costs relative to all the different relief costs today. Since a lot of these estimates have come out, disasters have gotten worse, they're more frequent, they're more intense, they're more damaging. What that means for the relative utility of relief versus prevention spending, I'm not sure, and I haven't seen an updated good study that did the systematic comparison. But until a few years ago, the calculus is definitely, in terms of future costs, definitely on the side of prevention as opposed to relief. As these disasters become more intense, more frequent, and affect more and more people in more and more ways, the relief part is going to grow exponentially as well, right? So yes, this is all expensive. All of this is going to require megabucks. Which exactly is the more cost-effective way right now, I can't tell you, but based on these studies from a few years ago, it's much more cost-effective to try to mitigate and prepare for, maybe not for every type of crisis, not for every type of disaster. Maybe there's some prevention and preparedness measures that are much more costly than the equivalent amount spent on relief after these things happen. But overall, categorically speaking, I would stand by these estimates.
Thank you, Tali. I want to thank everybody for their questions and for being a great audience. Thanks. This was great. And congratulations again on being this speaker.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks so much for this honor. I appreciate it.